Welcome to our 2023 webinar series. Each month, you'll learn about insurance solutions you and your clients can consider, plus the significant impact on insurers and their post-pandemic strategies. Each webinar will last about 50 minutes, and you must be logged on for the full 50 minutes to receive CFP credit. Please be sure to ask questions as you have them and typing them in the questions box. Today's presenter joined LLIS in 2003, assumed the role of president in 2005, and CEO in January 2013. He continues to monitor the insurance and financial services industry to provide you and your clients with the most up-to-date recommendations. Here to talk about long-term care is Mark Maurer.
Thanks, Claudia. And I always sound so grown up when she reads that. Thank you for doing that for me. Okay, so today we are going to be California dreaming. Not about lots of other things that California is famous for, like fish tacos, which I could go for right now, but we're going to talk about long-term care and just sort of what's going on in the state of California, what we know, what we don't know, and then we're going to also talk about what happened in the state of Washington as we won't know exactly what's going to happen in California, but we have one state that set up a state-provided long-term care program. So it's going to be sort of a baseline for what could happen in California. There we go. Okay, so across the country, a lot of different states have looked at what's happening in the realm of long-term care, what states are paying for, how much they're paying for it, and have started looking at researching this idea of some sort of state-provided long-term care benefits in addition to the normal Medicaid, Medicare programs. Most of that also includes some sort of additional tax to pay for this care. So we have maybe a third of the different states who have some sort of, have started to research, started to look at this, maybe have something gone to the legislature, either it's stalled, it's been defeated, what have you. But a number of different states have started to research this idea of state-provided long-term care benefits. And that's the considering color. Passed, state of Washington. They passed this a few years ago. 2021 was when it really all sort of came to a head, and we're going to talk about a bunch of that. But progressing is in this middle between we have something, we're sort of thinking about it, and California has actually progressed further than any other state at this point. And why are we looking at this? Well, there's also federal legislation being considered out there. So it's not just each state, it's at a federal level. The WISH, Well-Being Insurance for Seniors to Be at Home WISH Act. And this was proposed in 2021. It has a payroll tax function to it, part paid by employee, part paid by employer wages. So it's not only is this a states are looking at it, the federal people at the federal level are looking at this. And why? Because Medicaid spent approximately 138 billion with a B on long-term care services in 2021. Medicaid is the primary payer of long-term care services, covering over half of all long-term care services spending in the United States. So all of that is being, Medicaid is paid out, or taxes go up to the federal government and it's distributed back to the states to pay Medicaid benefits. Half of long-term care services in the country are being paid by Medicaid. And what's happening right now is that the boomers are continuing to get older. So we have this group of people who are going to start using the care more. We have all of these expenses. We have more people who might be needing it. and really not any sort of mechanism to pay for it. So all of these states, even the federal government, are looking at, we're paying all of this for long-term care through the Medicaid program, and we really are going to, we really would like to find another way to help pay for it. But in California, so much of this is going on. There's always, anytime you have something like this, there are going to be some bad actors, some bad apples. So much so that the state insurance commissioner sent a letter to everybody licensed in the state of California. It says, please review the attached agent broker alert regarding false and misleading long-term care insurance marketing tactics. Because people are out there saying there is going to be a program, there is going to be a tax. This is what it's going to look like. None of those things are true. So we're going to talk about where we are at this point, what happened in Washington, and things that you as advisors need to know when your clients are asking you these questions, and maybe some steps to be thinking of so that you're one step ahead. So what you need to know, what's happened, what is fact. A task force was established in 2019 to recommend options for designing and implementing a public long-term care insurance program. So 2019, state of California said, we're making a task force, so let's research this. They have two reports. The first one was a feasibility report, and that was submitted to the governor and legislature in December of 2022. And then an actuarial report. So now we're talking actuaries go into the benefits and pricing part of it, to be submitted by 1/1/2024. And this is unfortunately what a lot of people are saying is a law. It's not. It's an actuarial report that's supposed to be submitted by this date to the state of California. Some people are using this as an excuse to say that's when they're going to put in a law. You better get long-term care, before that. That's not true. This is what's happening. Nothing's been decided, nothing's been done. This actuarial report hasn't even been submitted yet. So the task force, again, what you need to know. Task force recommended various possible structures for a public long-term care program, including different funding mechanisms. One of those is funding the program by instituting a payroll tax on California employees. If any of you live in Washington State or have clients who work in Washington State, sounds very familiar because that's what Washington State did. So it sounds familiar, but that's just one option of something that a task force looked at. Might be other options. Nothing's set in stone. They've also recommended consideration be given to allowing residents who have a qualifying private long-term care policy to opt out of the public program. What does that mean? That means they would not be subject to the payroll tax. This is what got everybody so hopped up in Washington State. Not all of a sudden that all of these people realize that long-term care is something they need as part of their overall financial plan. They didn't like the idea of paying a payroll tax and wanted to see, if I have an existing policy, can I opt out of the public program, opt out of this payroll tax? And it is possible. Again, nothing's been decided. There is no plan. But it is entirely possible that only policies purchased prior to a certain date would qualify to allow a resident to opt out of the program. What is that date? Who knows? There is no program. There is no plan. Nothing is set in stone. These are all ideas, parts of what California is researching. But this says that there may be the potential that as of a certain date, you must have had a long-term care policy in place if there's an opt-out, which there may not be. And I'll give you a reason why nobody wants to give a big long opt-out period in a little bit. States don't want people to opt out. States want everybody to be in this program and pay for it. But it's possible that there's a date maybe once the plan goes into place or the plan's been decided, that's the date. It may not be 6 months, a year in the future to let people have a chance to get policies to be able to opt out. So what are these dates? Well, as of today, here's where we are. So I want to be clear, and this is directly from that false and misleading tactics thing, because I want to be very clear about this, because I'm talking about what might happen, but not necessarily what is happening. So as of today, the legislature has not received the task force final report, has not decided to implement a public program yet. Nope. Not established the means of funding such a program, which, by the way, they haven't decided to implement yet. Has not decided if consumers will be allowed to opt out of such a program if they have a private policy. So not only is there no plan, there is not a plan to pay for this plan that doesn't exist. And if you have an existing plan, then you may not be able to sign out of the opt out of the plan that doesn't exist for the plan of the plan of the plan. The legislature has not decided what type of coverage would qualify for opting out. Who knows? There's no plan yet. And lastly, because this is the one that's getting that people are taking advantage of in California, thinking that January 1st, 2024 is this date. Nothing is set in stone. The legislature has not decided what date, if any, would be the cutoff date for purchasing a private policy among other major policy considerations. So not only is there no decision on an opt-out, there's no decision on a date if there was an opt-out. So my again, probably belaboring the point here, but trying to explain nothing is set in stone. So all of that we're talking about is basically guesswork on what may happen here shortly. In short, this is in quotes again from that false and misleading long-term care insurance tactics thing we got. In short, the legislature has not made any decisions about a public program at all. No payroll tax is being implemented, and there is no, quote, opt-out date at this time. So hopefully we're clear on that. There's none of this. We don't have any of this. But what we do know is that by January 1st, the next step towards implementing a plan is going to be submitted. What any of that looks like, we don't have any idea, which makes all of this very hard to plan. So in case any of you all are big Steven Seagal fans, or used to be in the 90s, very hard to plan. Most of you, all of you are familiar with the old, when you're looking at mutual funds, any different investments, past performance is no guarantee of future results. So everything that we know about California is almost nothing at this point. But history, if we look at history, look at what another state did, then we have an idea. We have a blueprint, if you will, about what happened in Washington State, and what we may be able to intuit or sort of just expect is going to happen in California, knowing that all of this could be completely different. But most of us tend to do something that somebody else has already done, and maybe we tweak it, we do a little bit different, but whatever the new iPhone is, it's really just the old iPhone with a little bit of tweaks. The first one was a big deal. So the first state long-term care program, nothing like it had been done before. Any other state, in theory, is just going to learn from what Washington did, improve this, improve that, and try to fix it. So we're going to talk about what happened in Washington State, because many of you maybe didn't have clients, weren't in Washington State, and weren't necessarily keeping track of it as much as we were for all the advisors and clients who were in Washington. So the Washington State Long-Term Care Trust Act. As a side note, they eventually became the Washington State CARES Fund. And I think it's ironic that in most states, you can't call a long-term care policy a long-term care policy unless it has a 2-year benefit period. But the Washington CARES Act has just a 1-year benefit period. So I think maybe they changed the name because it's not necessarily really long-term care. I digress. So what did this CARE Act do? CARES Fund. It's designed to address the public funds that continue to be used to pay for long-term care expenses. We're not going to stop paying Medicaid eligible people, not going to kick them out on the streets, not going to help them pay for care. So if we're going to keep putting the money out, let's find a way to bring some extra money in. How do we do that? By levying a payroll tax to create a fund for long-term care benefits. So we're going to take payroll funds in, or Washington's going to take payroll taxes in, create this pool that pays for a little bit of benefits for people to basically keep people from going on Medicaids as fast. And then once that's exhausted, maybe then they're going to go on Medicaid. Payroll tax was to begin in 2022. They had some issues with this. And from my understanding, the payroll tax began in July 1st of 2023. Who is subject to the tax in Washington? Residents of Washington. Kind of makes sense. 18 years or older, W-2 employees. This was one of the things that they got fixed or adjusted, or however you want to call it. Originally, people who worked in other states or lived in other states but worked in Washington were going to be subject to the Washington payroll tax, because the system was more so not necessarily where does the person live, but where is this business who's responsible for collecting the payroll taxes. They did create an opt-out because in order to receive benefits, you have to be residing in Washington. So this was something that changed from that when we start collecting taxes that needed to, in my sometimes not so humble opinion, kind of needed to be worked out. If I live in Oregon, work in Washington, and or even live here in Florida, but my employer happens to be a Washington State employer, should I be paying the taxes? Because I have to actually live in Washington to be eligible. So they got that fixed. Who's not subject to the taxes? Self-employed individuals are exempt. They can opt out. They actually were given the option to opt into the program and start having the payroll taxes deducted. So they had that option to be able to say, I'm a self-employed person, but I'd like to go ahead and opt into the program. Retired people, it's a payroll tax. If you don't have any payroll, you're not working, you're not on anybody's payroll, not going to be eligible for the tax. So there you go. How much is the tax in Washington State? Well, it's an uncapped tax of 0.58% of wages. And employers collect it and submit the tax revenue to the state. So I imagine many of you could do this in your heads, but let's assume, for the sake of argument, kind of now, that the equilibrium is somebody making $100,000 and they're going to pay $580 a year in taxes. So let's just say that person is paying the right amount. for the benefits. Okay, so I'll use this example later, but we're going to say that $100,000 income is our median, our mean, right in there. 580 is the ideal. If everybody was paying 580, then this plan would be just right. How do you vest in the benefit? So you actually have to have been working for a little while to be eligible for benefits. Have to have been working a little while and have paid into it. Must be employed and pay the premium tax either for 10 years without an interruption of 5 or more years, or 3 years within the last 6 years. So someone who's a year from retirement and is only going to work for 1 more year, that comes down to sort of individual choice. Should that person just pay the premium tax and be done with it, or get long-term care? Obviously, if they need a traditional long-term care policy for planning, and most people probably do, or would be good for them to have, then they should be doing that. If someone doesn't necessarily need long-term care, whether they have too much money, too little, may just be a scenario where somebody pays a tax for a year, year and a half, knowing they're not going to get anything out of it, but doing other things was going to cost them more. And this person must have worked at least 500 hours during each of the 10 years or 3 years required. So payroll tax, long story short, somebody works for 6 months this year and then retires, they're not going to be eligible for benefits. Qualifying for benefits. Must be at least 18 years old and also not disabled prior to 18. This was why they fixed that thing we were talking about before about Washington residents. You must be a Washington state resident at the time of claim to be eligible for benefits. And from some things I'm reading, they're trying to work on that maybe benefits won't be, may be able to apply to receive some benefits even if you're not in Washington state at the time of claim, and almost like a reimbursement from something you've been paying in to the payroll tax. And you need assistance with 3 of 10 activities of daily living. So you're probably looking at that one and going, now Mark, I've listened to you all dozens of times. I've heard Jill, I've heard Jerry talk about needing 2 out of 6 activities of daily living. And that's a traditional long-term care policy. Traditional long-term care policy, you're unable to perform 2 of the 6 activities of daily living, or have cognitive impairment like Alzheimer's, dementia, to qualify for benefits under they call it a tax qualified long-term care policy. The IRS made those rules. If those are the triggers, then any benefits you might receive are not taxable to you. So this has 3 of 10 activities of daily living, and here are the 10 different ones. Is it going to be harder or easier to qualify? Maybe. In one example, if you have a cognitive impairment, it's not a standalone. You would need that plus 2 others. So many of us have probably familial experience with somebody with Alzheimer's, dementia. Starts off as a little forgetfulness, but they dress themselves, all of their normal activities are completely fine. Just worry about leaving the stove on, or wandering out of the house. So that may be a scenario where it's harder to qualify because you need to have the cognitive impairment plus the ability not to bathe yourself or eat. In other scenarios, maybe 3 are easier. Dressing, bathing, and body care. Maybe that becomes easier than the 2 of 6. Who knows? In some ways, I think that the cognitive impairment not being its own makes it in general probably a little harder to qualify for benefits. And when are benefits available? Well, an individual can go on claim originally beginning January 1st, 2025. From what I understand, it's now 2026. Again, partly because there were those things that needed to get ironed out. So the payroll tax didn't get collected for a while, for months, a little bit over a year and a half, longer than they expected. So benefits, being eligible for benefits, having paid in for those benefits, took a little while to get there. maximum benefit is 36.5. That may be indexed for inflation in the future. So that 36,500 is a lifetime benefit that can be accessed in $100 units. $100 times 365, or $100 a day over 1 year, gives us the 36,500. So it's 1 year of long-term care benefits, $100 a day, which that 36.5 may be index inflation in the future, but $100 today is a good start. It's not going to cover a lot of care that people might need. 36.5 is 1 year of benefits. Now, if you need care for 3 years or 4 years, you're going to use this because you're going to use it first year, but you ran out early. And there's this provision that says you may be able to receive more than 100 if you get approved for that, but you'll still not get more than the 36.5, at least as of today, until they index it for inflation. So if you could start getting, in theory, $200 a day, it's only going to last you 6 months. So in Washington State, how was that tax able to be avoided, that 0.58% payroll tax? By owning a long-term care insurance policy by November 1st of 2021, allowed people to opt out of the tax and the program. You had to have the policy in place by November 1st. Then you also file for an exemption between October 1st of 2021 and December of 2022, attesting to having long-term care insurance. From what I understand, this was a website. You gave your name, a little bit of information about you, took a either PDF or a picture of your policy, submitted it, and kind of said, you're good. I think it was that simple from what I understand. Then you get this letter, you get the statement that you have an exemption letter from the state, and the employee has to give that to not only their current employer, but all future employers to avoid the tax so that the employer doesn't withhold this payroll tax. But once you opt out, the individual may never receive benefits from the program. Kind of makes sense. If you opt out of something, you're not going to be able to get benefits from it. So what did they say long-term care insurance is? Well, long-term care insurance was traditional long-term care. And then the last line of the Washington regulation mentioned the portion of a life insurance contract that provides long-term care under this particular section 7702B of the Internal Revenue Code. So what was considered eligible to opt out? Traditional long-term care, and then life insurance, and I think there was another part that even mentioned annuities that has the 7702B definition of long-term care attached to the policy. So what, according to that, is long-term care then? Standalone long-term care policies. You can't say you have a long-term care policy to opt out and not opt out long-term care policies. But additionally, were long-term care riders attached to life insurance annuities that are filed under the 7702B definition of being a long-term care rider. Other insurance, life insurance policies, maybe annuities, I'm not aware of, but at least life insurance policies, many also have a chronic illness rider. The triggers are often the same, the benefits work very similarly, but some of those are filed under a different Internal Revenue section. So while most of us would consider long-term care and the words chronic illness to be very similar, or maybe even the same thing, the Washington guidelines said it uses this particular IRC definition. It didn't say other definitions won't meet, but it named one. So the general consensus across the industry was traditional long-term care and insurance or annuities that meet that 7702B. So that was probably about half the insurance companies that have a long-term care a 7702B rider for the accelerated benefits. The other half of insurance companies use a chronic illness. This is Washington. What's California going to do, if anything? Who knows? I got a question here. If someone has both long-term care policies now, but didn't opt out of Washington Cares, can both coverages be used? Absolutely. That's my understanding, because you're paying for something. You're paying the payroll tax, so you're eligible for the long-term care benefits through the state. Plus, you have your own policy, which you'd be able to use. For example, shifting to own long-term care policy after exhausting benefit of Washington Cares. Yes, that's my assumption. And this actually brings up a good point, that a lot of insurance companies are trying to work with the states ahead of time to say, hey, Washington, if we'd known you were going to do a 1-year benefit for $100 a day, we might have designed policies in Washington that sort of carve out the first $100 a day for a year. Maybe we would have created a Washington state 1-year elimination period to kick in after that. So not only would you possibly have people not opting out, but you'd have people who now are building onto the other policy, people who are saying that 1 year, that's pretty good for long-term care, I might need it longer, and then having policies that kick in after 1 year. So good question. Thank you for that one. So back to Washington State. So as we were going through all of this, people asked us, are there minimum benefits required in a long-term care insurance policy? No minimum benefits were specified in the law. That's going to be a problem here in a minute, and I'll show you. What proof is required to show that an individual purchased and continues to own long-term care insurance policy? Because ideally, the program should say, we're letting you opt out of this program now when you're in your 40s, because you're going to have your own long-term care policy in your 60s, 70s, 80s. You're not going to go on Medicaid. So you would think you'd want people to hold on to their policies, but unfortunately, there's no provision. I have heard and read probably the closest thing to call them is rumors, that state of Washington is looking back at this and wanting to do some sort of recertification. It may be too late because that wasn't the rule back then, but they would like a lot of the people who maybe got policies and didn't keep them very long to come back into the program. But as of right now, there's no provision that says you opted out in 2021. There's no provision that says you have to keep that policy. So who did it make sense to opt out? Who are the most people? Individuals and families with disposable dollars to spend on a long-term care insurance policy. High income people. The tax is 0.58% of payroll. So whether you make 50,000, 100,000, $500,000, or $1 million, you get the same benefit. But that person who made $1 million paid $5,800 a year for that same benefit. Person making $100,000 paid $580. Person making $50,000 paid $290. They all got the same benefit. So the person making a lot of money is paying more than they need to. So those were the people who were going to pay the most tax, but not get more in benefit. So they were going to opt out. Younger individuals who plan to stay in Washington, again, usually higher income people. People nearing retirement who weren't going to vest in the state benefit. Obviously, people planning to leave Washington. It's nice today in Florida. A couple of weeks ago, it was pretty hot. This weekend, it was gorgeous. So you want to work in Washington for the next 10, 15, 20 years. But as soon as you're coming to Florida, then you don't necessarily want to be paying into this for 15, 20 years because you don't plan on being in Washington when you're 80 and need care. And people who want more comprehensive coverage. Remember, it's $100 a day for 1 year. That's about it. Question, if you moved out of Washington, but employer did not change your change of address and you were still charged, can you request a refund? I don't have any knowledge of that. Sorry. Okay, who might want to opt into the plan? I just kind of said, if it's the high income people who want to opt out, the low income people are going to get the most out of it. They're going to pay very little for the same benefits, but still get the same benefit as everybody else. And people who are nearing the retirement who will vest in the program. If you're nearing retirement and you're not going to vest, you may want to get out. But if you're going to vest in it, you can pay in for 3 years and be eligible for benefits. That's kind of the sweet spot. You sort of won there. So what happened in the state of Washington when all of this went down? As you can see, it was a tidal wave of applications, tidal wave of questions, tidal wave of a lot of things. And so what we experienced, and there's an awful lot on this slide. I don't expect you all to be able to read all of these different things. As we were going through it, Claudia said she was sort of leaning close to it, trying to read everything. But our first email about this was in March of 2021. The expiration or the cutoff date for having long-term care in place was November of 2021. And I'm going to talk about some companies in particular, but this progression shows that as that tidal wave of applications started hitting insurance companies, they all started doing things to stem the flow. They started saying, we're not, Lincoln National was the first one. They stopped offering their long-term care rider on their traditional life insurance policies. They were the first one because they were getting too many applications, too many, whatever, to be able to handle what was going on. And then what you see is insurance companies started raising the minimums. Because remember, the rule, the Washington rule did not specify a minimum benefit you were supposed to have. So a lot of people were getting what I call throwaway policies. 40-year-old male, what's the smallest daily benefit I can get? $50 a day. Let's do that. What's your shortest benefit period? 2 years. All right, let's do that. How about an inflation rider? Don't think you need it. There's nothing that says you need it. Okay, let's not do that. Premium is $200 a year. Insurance companies know that that's not real planning. That's not any sort of, does this person really understand the need for long-term care coverage? Or are they using this to help protect their families? No. They went to what's the cheapest thing to be able to get out of this plan, and I'm probably going to cancel it as soon as I can. And so insurance companies made lots of changes along the way to eventually just stopping offering coverage altogether. So Mutual of Omaha, in the world of long-term care insurance, there's maybe less than 10 or less companies that are really in the business of offering traditional long-term care policies. 6/11, so remember the cutoff date is November 1st. 6/11, Mutual of Omaha made some changes. And like I said, they were probably getting all these throwaway policies. Minimum issue age increased to age 40. Because they're guessing that people under 30 really aren't buying this or planning. They're buying it to get out of a tax. Minimum monthly benefit increased to $3,000. I think it was $1,500 initially. So, and we're going to require an inflation rider. So we either, so what Mutual of Omaha did is say, we're getting too many, I keep using the word throwaway policies, but it kind of works. I don't want to say junk policies because it's a good policy. It's just too many minimum benefit policies, not really designed for planning. So we're going to increase our minimums to make sure that we're looking at people who this is actually good, probably good planning for. All those increases. Even with that, 6 days later, stopped all long-term care insurance sales in the state of Washington. Not anywhere else, not any other state, just Washington. Made those increases. I'm guessing there were still, by the time they made that increase on the 11th, they still didn't know what they had in the hopper from before then. Started even processing it with even all those increases. 6 days later, stopped all long-term care sales in the state of Washington. It's almost half a year before that November 1st guideline. So that's that tidal wave of applications. As soon as people understood there's this payroll tax, but you can get out of a payroll tax by getting a long-term care policy, the floodgates just open. NGL, sort of, I picked them because I had a few different options. On 5/24, so a little bit earlier than Mutual of Omaha, we're going to raise our minimum from the $50 a day to $100. Okay. Then our next step back in July was we're going to increase our minimum annual premium. My dad has the phrase, you can either raise the bridge or lower the river. Both companies said we need to make sure that these are not just minimum benefit policies. So Mutual of Omaha said we're going to raise our benefit minimums. NGO did the same thing, but a different way, just said we're increasing the premium. It's got to be at least $2,000 a year. Make sure people are actually doing this for planning, not just to opt out of tax. Month later, minimum annual premium is now $3,000. 3 days later, okay, no more lifetime pay, only our 10-pay option. So instead of $3,000 a year, it might be $6,700. So even that, they're trying to, requiring a $6,000 minimum. So they're trying to get people who are actually really planning or really doing this. Two weeks later, all long-term care sales suspended. And most companies did something in this way, shape, or form. Some sort of requiring minimums here, minimums there, whether it's minimum premiums, minimum benefit amounts, but trying to stem this flow to say, let's make sure these are real plans before we shut it off. And it was just like dominoes falling. Mutual of Omaha stopped first because they're one of the probably the primary long-term care company out there. So they just got flooded first, and just whatever that is, 4.5, 5 months before the deadline, just said we're good. We need months just to process what we've got in house. 8/6, Hancock and Securian suspended their long-term care riders or hybrid life long-term care policies until 11/1, and that was pretty common. We have suspended until 11/1 because they knew what people were doing. Not until we're cleaned up, not until we're got all these applications done. Nope, until 11/1. 5 days later, Nationwide and Mutual of Omaha, life long-term care riders suspended, and then just daily. 8/13, Pac Life. 8/14, One America. You might know it as State Life. 8/16, Transamerica, no long-term care rider on our policies. 8/18, New York Life. 8/20, Mass Mutual. 8/23, NGL. 9/8, Lincoln was the last one, but their Money Guard, they have a Money Guard policy, but they'd raised their minimum so high they could hold out longer. I think their minimum annual premium was $7,500 a year. So they weren't inundated as much as other companies who could find traditional long-term care policy for $200-300 a year. So Lincoln was the last, but they had those highest premiums. So now if I'm going to put on my prognostication hat, if California does a plan, it's going to have little or no grace period because you need the high income people paying into the plan. So using my equilibrium, we have a physician's assistant making $100,000 a year and she's paying $580 into the plan. That's the right amount. To the other side, we have 4 nurses making $50,000 a year. They are paying $290 a year, which is actually below average. So they're not paying enough in. We say the value of this is $580. They're only paying in $290 a person. So for our PA, she's paying the right amount. For those 4 nurses, then we need Dr. McGee here on the left making $300,000, and she's paying $1,740 in taxes. The value of what she's getting isn't any more because she's paying more. She gets the same thing. But if we say the value per person is $580 a year, when we have these 6 people, we're in equilibrium. 1 person's paying the right amount, 4 people paying less than they should, 1 person paying more than they need to. But who's opting out? It's Dr. McGee. McGee said, I can go buy a long-term care policy for $1,100. So I'm going to go do that, save $600 in taxes. But what just happened? We opted out the high income person. Our PA's paying the right amount, and we still have those 4 nurses. They're still paying less. So at that moment, for this group of 6 people, the plan's 40% underfunded, using those very simplistic numbers. So states don't want to let people opt out. They don't, Washington, in hindsight, probably shouldn't have done that because they were expecting 100,000 people to opt out. And who is that going to be? It's going to be the Dr. McGee's, the high income people. They had such a long runway of opt-outs. And originally, I think it was a July 1st opt-out, and they extended it to November. They let 500,000 people opt out. So that's 400,000 extra opt-outs, 400,000 Dr. McGee's. So using my numbers, which I don't know if it's a 1 and a 1 and a 4, but using my numbers, that's 1.6 million people who are making $50,000 a year who are offsetting, who are paying $290 for something that should cost $580, but we don't have Dr. McGee's to offset that. So without the high income earners, the cracks are beginning to show. My prognostication number 2. So my guess, if California does something, which it's not set in stone, that there's going to be recertification. Maybe annual. I probably wouldn't do annual because that's just a lot of work, but every 3 or 5 years just to make sure that people have it, because without it, long-term care insurance companies may just push pause in the state of California. If there's any sort of runway, any sort of, you have 6 months to opt out, insurance companies may just say, you know what, if there's nothing that says people have to keep policies, we're just going to not offer coverage. Using our experience, we had 88 Washington residents put policy in force between when we sent out our email and the cutoff date. 17 of those have lapsed or been canceled, and that's a 19% lapse rate. For anybody who's heard me or Jerry or Jill talk about kind of long-term care and how policies have progressed over the years, the reason we have rate increases is because people don't lapse their long-term care policies. They get their policies, they hold on to them for dear life because they're older, they're unhealthier, they can't get new coverage. So 19% is way outside of what insurance companies expect for lapses on the normal long-term care world. So an insurance company looks at that and says, we did all that work, and 19, almost 20%, 1 out of 5 is going to lapse within a year or 2. We may just not play. That's an awful lot of work. That may not be, even if we keep those other 80 around, they'll probably drop off over time, and it just may not be that it makes good economic sense for us. Because people opted out. From what I can tell, it's a one-time thing. We told people, we told clients, we told advisors, here's what's going on. There may be some recertification, but people saw this and said, thanks for the reminder. We no longer need this policy in place, so it will be lapsing. If Washington changes and there's some recertification, I don't know what people can do. Or like the one guy told me, we'll burn that bridge when we get to it. So without this sort of recertification, insurance companies may just decide that if there's this period of opt-out time, you know what, we don't want to do all of this work for months and have people just drop these policies. And So because we need to do this, because the states want the high income people to stay in the program, my prognostication is there's not going to be a long runway for opt-out. And I expect that people need to keep their policies. My other guesses, because these are all guesses, traditional long-term care, yes, that would be eligible for an opt-out if there's an opt-out to a plan that doesn't exist. Mutual of Omaha, age 30 is a minimum issue age, NGL, age 40. The 7702B rider on a life or long-term care policy, I would expect that would be similar too. That's qualified under long-term care. The chronic illness riders, I would say those are probably not. But there's no plan. There's no rules because there is no plan. So this is all guess. So what do we do? Let's go back to the basic premise of insurance, which is a thing providing protection against a possible eventuality. I don't know if I'm going to die before I get to retirement, but I have term life insurance that protects my family in case I do. I certainly hope I don't become disabled if something happens to me before retirement, but I have my disability insurance in case I do. Insurance is a thing providing protection against a possible eventuality. A personal long-term care policy providing protection against a possible payroll tax need to pay for care out of other assets. Substituted two phrases for two words, but that's what we're talking about. Having a personal long-term care policy against the possibility. It's not a lock that there's a payroll tax. It's not a lock that they're going to need to pay for care out of other assets. But a personal long-term care policy may prevent against the possible payroll tax. But who to talk to first? Clients in their 40s with large incomes. They have the most working years, most time to pay taxes, probably high incomes. They're paying the most amount of taxes. So if we use Washington state tax numbers of 5.98, because since we have no California numbers, there is no plan today, there is no law. So no one's above the law in this place because there is no law. You know, it's really hard to fit Steven Seagal into a long-term care presentation. It comes in, it works a little bit here, it works a little bit there, but you know what, sometimes it sort of fits. So thank you all for being patient with me and just, you know, smiling when it's a little clunky. So premiums to payroll tax. Here's a male-female couple. If we look at $100 per day, traditional long-term care policy with a 2-year benefit, so $100 a day is about the Washington state number. 2 years each, it's a minimum benefit, but longer than the Washington state, 3% inflation, because the Washington state could have been increased by inflation. Here's the translation to incomes. So for a couple who are both age 30, if their joint income was $379,000, a 0.58% payroll tax, a Mutual of Omaha long-term care policy for them combined at age 30 is $2202. If we compare so $2202 is 0.58% of a $379,000 joint income. So if they're making $100,000, they're going to pay $580 in taxes. The long-term care costs $2,200. So they probably wouldn't do that. If their income is $380,000 or more, they can get the long-term care policy and pay less than the payroll tax. If we go to age 40, depending on insurance companies, $255, $392. If they're in their 50s, $305, $477. So if you have a couple making $500,000, $600,000 a year, they can get a long-term care policy for less than the taxes and be able to opt out using Washington state's numbers. So those were the people who were opting out. People in their 40s making $750,000 a year, they can get an NGL policy for $1,477 or pay $3,000, $4,000 a year in payroll taxes. That's who was opting out. So who do we talk to next? High income earners of all ages. You're going to pay a lot more in taxes. clients close to but not on the doorstep of retirement. So those are those people. I go back and forth. If I'm going to work for another year, I might just suck it up and pay the payroll tax if I have enough or don't have enough to look at traditional long-term care. If I'm 6 or 7 years away, probably good to be looking at long-term care anyway. Clients who really don't like taxes. And you know what? There's a lot of us out there who just really don't like taxes. So, you know, just is what it is. So, is it possible that there is a very long opt-out period? Is it possible there's a year-long opt-out period? Yes, of course there is. We know nothing. Also, is it possible that California never implements a plan? Yes. So you could say, Mark, I want my clients to get long-term care coverage to be ahead of this payroll tax. And I'll say there is no payroll tax. And you say, well, I get it, but in case there is one and they have the ability to opt out, these are very high income earning people. I'd like to put this long-term care plan in place so that if there is one, they have that in place. So that's what we're looking at. That's what we're talking about. Is it possible there's no opt-out provision at all? Yes. So you could put insurance in place and there be no opt-out. You could put insurance in place and California never does something. Or you could put insurance in place, California does exactly what Washington State does, and your clients are able to opt out of the tax. So what to do? Come back to insurance. A thing providing protection against a possible eventuality, a personal long-term care policy providing protection against a possible payroll tax or need to pay for care out of other assets. Because sometimes you or your clients may need to make an executive decision. I think that one landed pretty well. All right, questions? I see a couple coming in. Let's see. California resident, working for 5 more years, $250,000 annual salary, probably moving out of state upon retirement. What would you advise? Enough assets not to need long-term care insurance. See, these are these questions that we don't really have you know, an answer to. I have to think about that. You're sort of that's a good one because you gave me sort of a right on the cusp of everything. If the income was a lot higher, probably look at a long-term care policy. If it was more years or shorter years. So I think you stumped me. So I will think on that one and follow up with you. Follow up with you later. Another question, have there been any lawsuits questioning the constitutionality of these laws because they don't provide equal protection under law, i.e. rich people can opt out and poor people can't? No, there's nothing in particular that says people can or cannot. Everybody's given that option. It just depends on what it costs. So you have to have a policy in place, and you could have had that policy that you're paying $200, or you could have been somebody who decided to get that $200 a year policy and be able to opt out, and you wouldn't have to be very rich in order to have opted out with a $200 a year policy. So it just depended on what you did and what you think met the requirement for having long-term care. Question, how do you think it might have changed in Washington if they had capped the Washington Cares tax? Oh, I fully imagine that a lot less people would be in it, or a lot more people would be in it. I think a lot less people would have fought it. Yeah, absolutely. If the cap, let's say our example is 580 is the right number, and you looked at your statistics of people and said we need, a lot of people are going to be paying less, but we really don't need Dr. McGee's paying $3,000 or $4,000 a year. We'll cap them at $1,000 a year. So basically, they might pay for their own and one other person's, or in my example, pay for their own and enough to offset the nurses, or at least or two of the nurses, I think a lot less people would have jumped on this, because the people usually who were jumping were people who make a lot more money. And so the difference between the tax and a long-term care policy was significant. We as people are going to take the path of least resistance. So if I say I can pay the tax for 15, maybe my tax is capped out at $2,000 a year, but a long-term care policy is $1,800 a year. Hopefully they have you to say, actually, this long-term care policy is much better coverage, all these other things about it, so you're actually better off. But the average person might say, I got a quote, it's more than what my payroll tax is going to be. I'm just going to, kind of probably stop there. All right, good questions, everybody. There's a couple others that I'll answer, answer along the way and reach out to people individually. But thank you all again for tuning in. Like I said, this is something very hard to talk about, or very hard to plan for, because we don't know what's going to happen. But at least, so to the last question here, does the advisor make clients aware of what's going on now, or wait until there's more information? I don't know. So as I said, who might I talk to first? A married couple of doctors. If this comes down using Washington state numbers, you're going to be paying thousands of dollars, and we can put in a long-term care. You're probably in a position where you would, we'd like to talk about long-term care in the future. So now, while you're young, you're healthy, we can do this, get it set up. And if this comes down, you're set. If it doesn't come down, and I think maybe that's the key, these also should be clients who you say, this is good because it's long-term care. We're protecting your other assets from being spent down if you need care. This is something we were going to talk about at some point in the future anyway, because it, based on your income trajectory, your current assets, this is good planning. We're just talking about it earlier because of what's going on here at the state level. To me, those are those people who I would probably talk to first, and then just start looking down. But thank you again for everybody for tuning in. I hope everybody has a great rest of your Tuesday. Hope everybody has a great fall. And hopefully you've got a little cooler weather here than we do in Tampa, but maybe not too cold. So thank you everybody for tuning in. I appreciate it. Bye.